All right, second to last presentation, we're almost there. My name is Kevin Best. I work at the University of Michigan with Bobby Gregg and Elliot Rouse, and we're going to talk back again about walking stability, this time from the perspective of robotic prostheses. So we're going to talk about joint impedance, and by joint impedance I mean mechanical impedance, so the relationship between motion at the joint and the torque caused by that motion. So if I were to take this ankle joint and I were to move it at some delta theta of t, my impedance would tell me information about how my torque would change in response. So if we take this really abstract view of impedance, and I'm going to look at a single axis by taking the magnitude of that transfer function, we can see that common prosthesis control strategies span this axis. So on the low end, we have torque control, like we saw in the Friel simulation, which has a very low impedance because there's no direct relationship between the angle and the resulting torque. On the opposite end, we have kinematic trajectory tracking controllers, which enforce some nominal trajectory, and they respond very aggressively to any changes in torque. And somewhere in the middle here, we have what we normally call impedance controllers for prostheses. So they still respond to changes in torque, but not as aggressively as these hiding kinematic controllers. So why does joint impedance matter? Well, luckily, I'm almost last in this conference, and we've talked about this a lot. Disturbances and perturbations. So I've been searching for these throughout the conference. There's lots of things where, I've taken pictures of your feet, hope that's okay. Either the ground's uneven, or the bus is moving as Conrad gathers her ice cream money. So there's lots of ways where we deviate from nominal joint patterns, and we want to make sure we're responding appropriately in those. So for a more concrete example from my own life, this is my dog, and this is what the floor looks like after she plays with all of her toys. Pretty commonly the next morning, I'll walk out in the dark and accidentally step on one of those toys. And you can see that I would get very different torque responses from different kinds of controllers. So I would get maybe a much lower reaction torque from that disturbance in a low impedance case, and a much higher one in a high impedance case. And we saw earlier that ankle torque has some effect on stability, so we think this might be important. So, to test this, we're going to use the open source leg here, the OSL, and we're going to control it in each of these paradigms. So to be able to do that, first we need to develop accurate impedance control. And then we're going to generate walking controllers, one that's very low impedance, like a torque controller, very stiff ones, like a kinematic controller, and then some stuff in the middle to be determined. And then we're going to apply perturbations, kind of like we saw with Martin's study, and we're going to see how stability is affected. The rest of this talk is going to be about this first point, because that's all I've done so far. It's not the most exciting stuff, but it's important to share for the community who uses the OSL. So this is the second generation OSL. You saw the first one in Brian's talk earlier. Some clever people in my lab have redesigned it to be lighter, cost less, and just kind of easier to deal with. So kind of highlights here are that it's an off-the-shelf actuator, and then just a single belt-driven transmission. One of the things it doesn't have, because we're trying to keep cost and weight down, is an output joint torque encoder. So if we want to do accurate impedance control, we've got to model these dynamics and account for them when we're doing our control. So I did just that. It's a simple physics-based model with joint inertia, some damping, and some frictions. I won't bore you with details, but so first, there's this. We kind of found when we were characterizing it that there's this unintentional series elastic actuator here because our belts are a little bit springy. So I didn't really think I was going to have to do this step, but we have some elasticity that makes things a little bit more complicated. But when we validate this through a bunch of frequencies and amplitudes, we get a high variance accounted for, so we're pretty confident that this model describes the system well enough. So to compensate for those dynamics, we take a frequency domain approach. It's pretty simple. We use state feedback. I can still write a closed-loop transfer function. And we use some basic gradient descent that says, hey, calculate my error transfer function. So I have desired system dynamics, and I have what my actual ones are. Take the difference, try to minimize that norm. And we just use the basic gradient descent to get those gains. It's simple, but it works. So we stuck this to the ankle joint. We stuck it on a dynamometer, and we ran it through a bunch of chirp signals. We tried to have it render different stiffness and damping pairs. So on the x-axis here, you'll see the desireds, and then what we actually give when we regress the data on the y-axis. If we do it perfectly, it'll look like these lines. We're not perfect, but we're much better with our compensation strategy than if we ignored those dynamics altogether. So that's where I am. We're pretty happy with this and we're going to move forward with the project. Next, we're working on generating those walking controllers. And the big question we still have is how do you measure walking stability? I've talked to a lot of you throughout the conference about this. We have a lot of ideas, but if anyone wants a buddy for the bus ride to talk about this kind of stuff, that'd be great. So I'd like to thank my co-authors and funding sources and open it for questions.
Yeah, I'm super sold on that you should do like system identification on your actuators and your transmission. I've never done it before. How long did it take you to like collect that data and then produce the variance accounted for?
So in reality, it's like a day of work to do it. The problem is that you do it like 12 times as you're designing your compensator and everything. So it's not super fast, and luckily the knee and the ankle, the way it's designed is that they're identical. So I only have to do this on the ankle, and then I know it works for the knee too. One of the things we're also still figuring out is I did this identification maybe 6 months ago, and we walked on the leg a lot. So is it still valid? These are the things we're answering right now. Siavash.
I have a question about that axis that you showed, the impedance for different controllers. Were you implying that impedance for example, EMG-based controller is 0 or 1?
So don't hold me super to this, but it's a very abstract view, right? One is going to say if I perturb the system, how quickly and aggressively will I immediately respond? So yeah, maybe eventually in an EMG system, someone will look at their foot, see it change, contract a muscle, and eventually the foot will change. But there's a lot of dynamics that happen between there versus a kinematic controller. We know it's going to be some proportional change, some derivative change, and it's going to try to fix it.
Okay,
Andy?
So I didn't get what your motor model included or didn't include.
Yeah.
And then did you then try to make some synthetic impedance and then test that system and see how well you did at it?
Yes, that's exactly what we did. We characterized the system, and then we said, okay, we know how you behave, try to render this synthetic impedance, and that's what those XY plots were.
Could you show it quick?
Yeah. Those plots.
You were just trying to be spring and damper.
Yeah, so that's commonly how people control prostheses, but you could apply this to any transfer function that you really have in the frequency domain.
And that was like steady state. What about reversing direction, for example?
So this is through the average throughout this kind of chirp. Let's see if I can get my video to play. Throughout this chirp signal. So we take this entire trajectory of increasing frequencies and we do a couple different amplitudes and we regress that. And I also have other plots in, I have other plots in the paper that show this in the frequency domain as like both plots.
Kind of along those lines, what's the bandwidth for your impedance estimations based on the chirp signal that you're using this year?
So right now, what happened is in the system ID, it gets scary to go super high frequency.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Okay.
Up to where I could test it worked, but yeah, things started shaking a lot moving higher.
Probably doesn't matter if you're trying to.
Yeah, I don't know. Like for a quick impulse perturbation, maybe it does matter because that's a super high frequency thing, but this is what I can do so far.
Is your compensation work on board the OSL, or is that something that you did?
No.
Okay.
So right now, I say like, okay, you know the trajectories of the impedance you want to do. It's offline. I haven't tried to speed it up. I think you could approximate this, but right now I haven't. Cool, thanks.